He is the clinical professor of neurology and neurosurgery and co-founder of the CTE Center at the Boston University School of Medicine, and is the co-founder, medical director, and chairman of the Medical Advisory Board Concussion Legacy Foundation. He consults with numerous NFL, NHL, and NBA teams and is the senior advisor to the NFL Head, Neck, and Spine Committee. He has been featured in interviews for the NFL with ESPN, HBO, and the Boston area news channels. Delegates, please give a huge hero's welcome to Dr. Robert Cantu.
Okay. Thank you. Who's that guy? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's I who want to applaud you for the efforts that brought you here today, and for the organizers who are now doing this, I guess, the fifth time. 60 plus years ago, when we may or may not have been fortunate enough to be in your chairs, there was nothing like this. And I think this is just an incredible situation, and I applaud all of you. Applaud your dancing, too. I hope that through our comments, we'll be able to leave you with 4 or 5 things that you'll reflect on a little bit now, and then maybe as you go through your wonderful careers in the decades ahead, have a chance to reflect on them again. And I guess, as is true of everybody who's coming out here to speak to you and with you, it's our own opinions. It's not necessarily something that everybody would agree with, but it's things that we've learned by trial and error through life. And that trial and error is not just the things that worked out, but as Richard has mentioned before, there are many more things that don't pan out than do. But if you keep at it and you don't give up, you'll definitely succeed. For 41 years, we did general neurosurgery, but we're probably most known for the work that we've done in the field of concussion and the sports aspect of neurological surgery, where we've been editor of sports sections of neurosurgery and world neurosurgery and other things. And that all came about because I loved playing sports as a kid growing up, and I loved pitching baseball for Cal Berkeley, where I went to college. After we had done our neurosurgery residency at Mass General and had started our academic career, the family kind of got moved to the suburbs, which was kind of popular at the time. You thought it was great for your kids. And I found myself on the sidelines of a high school football field, tasked with being the team physician for the local high school, at least on game day, and making decisions about a number of things, not the least of which were head injuries. But this was back in the 70s, and concussions weren't a big deal back in the 70s. Very few people took them seriously. But I thought, if I'm going to do this right, I'm going to have to understand what literature there is available about concussion. I'm going to have to understand what literature there's available about athletic concussion, which is about 0. And then use best common sense and best evidence that I know to try to make a logical return to play criteria for these athletes that we were taking care of. And so we wrote the first return to play guidelines back in the 80s, and in it had a grading scale, and in it had return to play criteria following a concussion. And I mention that as kind of where I start with some of the life lessons that I've learned, because I want to encourage all of you that if you encounter a vision somewhere along your career, or you encounter an area where there's great paucity of information, fill it. Fill it yourself, especially if that is something that's stimulating to you, because I can't tell you how much more exciting my life has become because of this involvement way back in the 70s and 80s, leading me through the American College of Sports Medicine and presidencies and so on, and experiences I never would have had I not sought that out in the very beginning. So this was that article. We'd had a number of publications before it, but this is the one that kind of turned my life around. And I want to go to a second life message. In that article, we talked about return to play criteria after a concussion, and in that article, we gave a grading scale for concussion. And the most mild concussions were those that had no loss of consciousness, no post-traumatic amnesia, no loss of memory prior to the event, or if it was there, it was very, very brief, 30 seconds or longer, and all the symptoms had to clear up within 30 seconds. And the intermediate concussions would allow you to be unconscious for less than 5 minutes, and the symptoms would be lasting longer than 30 minutes, and in the more severe concussions, the period of unconsciousness would last greater than 5 minutes, and the post-traumatic amnesia would be greater than 24 hours. And I want you quickly to forget that grading system, because it was the best we could do based on what we knew in the 70s and 80s, but it's not a very good grading system. And so in 2001, based on evidence that had accumulated over a 2-decade period, prospective evidence, we came out with a revised grading system in which the most mild concussions had no loss of consciousness and the symptoms cleared within 30 minutes. Intermediate would be one in which there may be very brief loss of consciousness for a few seconds, less than a minute, and the symptoms would not exceed a week. And the level 3 concussion would be one in which there would be more prolonged periods of unconsciousness greater than a minute, and the symptoms lasting greater than a week. And I can assure you that the way 99% of concussions get into the grade 3 category is not, on the athletic field at least, loss of consciousness greater than a minute, because that's very, very, very uncommon. It's almost always symptoms that are lasting greater than a week. I bring this up because as you will go on to the prestigious institutions that you'll become a part of, through your education and maybe post-education as well, it's very difficult for change to occur and be acknowledged. There are financial implications in terms of funding, there is prestige, there's lots of things involved, whereby it makes it very difficult for institutions to say, oops, this is wrong, we're going to change it, let's do this, and make it a public change, other than just simply moving forward. And you'll even find, as you go on to your careers and you publish in journals, you will not find journals other than retractions normally going and saying this was a mistake, this is really what it should have been. There'll just be additional publications which will advance the science. But individually, yourselves, I think you need to be true, and you can be true to what the science is telling you and what your experiences are telling you. And if you're seeing things go a certain way, investigate it, and don't necessarily, just because you've learned it a certain way, say that's the way it has to be. Concussions are not created equal. You don't need a grading system to manage concussions, but it's very important to understand how severe concussions are that somebody's had in the past if you're going to properly manage them in the future. And understanding a grading system or a way of figuring that out for yourself can be very, very important. That's not a good idea. I think you intuitively know that. If I were to walk over and hit a child in the head like that and knock them down and cause them to be getting up crying, I would be held for child abuse. And yet hundreds of times a year that's happening at the Pop Warner level, our lowest levels of youth football. And as the kids age out of that 5 to 9 into the 9 to 12 group, the numbers of hits actually go up. And rather amazingly, the acceleration forces the brain receives from those hits can be as high as what is seen at the high school and college level, even though the closing speeds are relatively slow or low, because the neck is so weak and the helmet on the head so heavy that it's like a bobblehead doll. It doesn't take much of a hit to snap the brain around violently inside the skull. That led me, seeing those hits, and more importantly, seeing those youngsters that came to the office that didn't clear up quickly with their concussion symptoms, but had very protracted symptoms, to go on to become a very strong advocate for trying to reduce head trauma at all ages, but certainly and most importantly at this young age where the brain is particularly vulnerable. And out of that came the book Concussion in Our Kids, where we point out that the young brain is largely unmyelinated, so it's easier for nerve fibers to be pulled apart and distracted physically. The young brain is also going connectivity connections, predominantly between the ages of 10 and 12, but of course before and after as well. And so it's particularly prone to trauma. So we felt that youngsters under the age of 14 should not be playing tackle football, should be playing instead flag football. Let's play football, let's learn the skills of the sport, let's practice tackling on dummies that don't hit you back in the head, but let's not bash heads. And in soccer, let's not have heading in soccer under the age of 14. Let's play soccer, let's take the ball off our chest, off our legs. In fact, youngsters do that better than they do using their heads. And in ice hockey, let's not have full contact in ice hockey under the age of 14. Let's play it, but play it without the body checking. Ice hockey, I think, has made great strides, and right now the checking only enters at the age of 13. Soccer in the last year made steps forward. They outlawed heading under the age of 10, and it's limited heading between the ages of 11 and 13. Football so far has not taken away tackle football. Believe me, I understand the pressures. I happen to consult to the NFL on their head, neck, and spine committee as a senior advisor. I'm a vice president of NOCSI, which is an organization that certifies the standards that all football helmets have to be made to. And NOCSI is largely funded by the sales of those football helmets and a stipend that goes to NOCSI from each one. So obviously by taking this posture about no tackle football under the age of 14, I don't endear myself to the NFL, and I don't endear myself to NOCSI, at least the manufacturers that fund it. But I think it's very, very important that if you feel passionately about something, that you muster your energies to become an advocate for what the science pushes you forward to say, and to do it in a way that is pushing forward the science. This is something that came from Lowell, University of Lowell, not too long ago, in 2016, where A survey was done, and 4/5 of people that responded to this survey were not favorable toward their kids playing tackle football under the age of 14. I'm not sure of the sample of this. I definitely know it didn't come predominantly from Texas. In this area of concussions, concussion today is getting, and has for the last 5 to 10 years, an awful lot of hype, perhaps too much. It's kind of the poster child for CTE, and I'll have a brief comment about that in a second. But the elephant in the room, what you're going to be reading about most in the next 5 years, are not exactly just concussion, but the effects of subconcussive blows. Because these are just a handful of publications in the last couple of years that talk about the fact that you can injure the brain structurally, as measured by diffusion tensor imaging looking at fiber tracts, or metabolically looking at PET scans, looking at metabolic functioning of the brain, or doing neuropsychological testing and doing cognitive tests. You can injure the brain just from an accumulation of subconcussive blows that can happen over a season, say, of football, by testing people preseason and postseason, or in soccer, as has been done by Dr. Lipton and his group. So subconcussive trauma is a big deal, and whenever you can reduce the amount of trauma at concussive or subconcussive level that somebody is taking, it's a good thing. And the biggest way you can do that is just practice without full contact, practice without hitting. And that's what the National Football League does. They only hit 14 times in 18 weeks of the season because of a collective bargaining agreement that put that rule in place. Whereas at college and high school and youth football, paradoxically, the amount of hitting is far, far greater. Because of our work with NOXI, because of our work with the National Football League, and because of our exposure to what repetitive head trauma is doing in terms of changing the trajectory of individuals' lives, in terms of what they genetically were predetermined to be able to achieve cognitively, or where they would be on the emotional ladder, or where they would be in terms of behavioral issues, in terms of controlling frustrating circumstances and not being irritable, and then having that all change negatively by repetitive head trauma. In 2007, we formed with Chris Nowinski, a Harvard football player who's gone on to have a post-Harvard life that included being in the WWE, but now being, I believe, one of the most outstanding advocates for concussion education, prevention, and treatment through being the CEO of Concussion Legacy Foundation that he and I founded in 2007. And in 2008, we partnered with Boston University to form the Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, or CTE Center. This is the progressive neurodegenerative disease that people are at risk for if they have too much repetitive head trauma. And if I can summarize 44 papers into just a couple of words, we don't find a direct correlation between the number of concussions people have had and their risk for CTE, but we do find a correlation between the total amount of head trauma they've taken, the total amount of hits to their head, which usually is best correlated with how many years of exposure they've had to a given activity. And those hits count the subconcussive hits. And that's why a sport like football, for the linemen especially, or boxing, where the amount of subconcussive trauma is daily and every single game, puts people at greater risk to have later life cognitive, behavioral, and mood issues as compared with other collision activities, say like ice hockey or lacrosse, where the individual hits may be as high as they would be in football, but the numbers of them would not. And before I turn it over to your questions, I just simply want to implore all of you as you go through life. I realize right now you don't think about these things, but find the balance, if you can, between work, play, which is very essential, and family. And as you go through life, take care of yourself and your own behaviors that will allow you to have a long, productive, happy career. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This is a bit different.
Thank you. I'll put you right here. Let's welcome back Eric Chen. Give it up for Eric. Eric, right here. Eric, take it away. I'll take it.
That was a wonderful talk, Dr. Cantu. And I mean, the kids had actually a lot of questions regarding your work, especially since it's kind of in this unique, underexplored field in the intersection of sports and medicine. And I think my first question for you is kind of in that line, where sports and science have really been seen as kind of very different spheres. And there hasn't been kind of too much in the intersection of those until recently, with kind of research into concussions, research even into the game and kind of what the proper plays are and all of that. So how has it been kind of working in that intersection, and what have been kind of the challenges you've faced as a result of working there?
Well, first, I think it's interesting to just reflect for a minute that our athletic fields are like a laboratory of trauma to the whole body and trauma to the head in particular, depending upon which sport you're talking about. So it offers a unique opportunity to study, especially the effects of repetitive head trauma. And I think it's extremely exciting for me to have begun in this field over 30 years ago when not very many people cared about it, and to have seen the explosion that's happened in especially the last 5 to 10 years in terms of interest.
And then kind of, there's this kind of stigma, especially in the NFL, against kind of reporting these concussions, these trauma. And how do you kind of deal with that when the players themselves aren't willing to report their own problems?
Yes, if I would let it get to me, I could be very frustrated. But I'm realist enough to simply say that I'll keep trying to be like water on a stone and keep pushing the ball forward, even though the ball sometimes has to go uphill because there are pressures that be. For instance, the National Football League is doing a wonderful thing over the last 5 years, having an outside company called Quintel's record injuries, including concussions. That's a good thing, to be keeping those statistics, to be recording them. What's less than perfect is the data itself. When, for instance, our own beloved New England Patriots last year had 1 reported concussion. That makes me roll my eyes a little bit.
And then also kind of a lot of the limelight in sports has been on kind of male athletes. And as a result, I imagine a lot of the focus on concussion research is also kind of on male athletes, things like that. How much of your research is kind of also looking at differing effects for female concussions or things like that?
Well, quite a bit, because it's very interesting that not just one report, but many reports in the literature, so many that it almost certainly is a fact, that women in the same activities as guys, like women playing soccer, women's playing ice hockey, women playing basketball, they have 2 to 3 times more reported concussions than guys do. Is this because women as a group, I'm not saying individually, I haven't encountered an underreporting within a given woman, but as a group, they're a whole lot more honest about reporting symptoms than guys? Or is it because women haven't worked as hard on their necks as guys? And to the extent your neck is strong and you see the blow coming and you can brace for it, you reduce the acceleration forces that your brain's going to see. But there's no question that if it's one or both of those reasons and others as well that we don't really understand now, this is a very important area to be studied because women are playing sports at risk of injuries and especially head injuries.
Now let's shift more towards kind of the treatment of concussions. Where do you see post-concussive treatment moving in the next few years, perhaps using stem cells or any other new technologies?
Well, before we get to stem cells, let's just talk about today versus 5 to 10 years ago. When I got into concussion research, diagnosis and treatment, for several decades after that, the treatment of concussion was rest cognitively and physically until the symptoms had cleared. And now I run a concussion center along with 2 other neurologists and 3 nurse practitioners and over 33 therapists because we are giving people with prolonged symptoms, post-concussion syndrome, cognitive therapy for those with cognitive issues, vestibular therapy for those with balance issues, ocular therapy for those with eye tracking issues, cervicogenic PT to the top of the cervical spine for people with neck pain and pain up the top of the head. We're also utilizing things like yoga, biofeedback, etc. So there is active treatment of post-concussion syndrome now that was not there just a few years ago. But let's talk about the persistent post-concussion syndrome. We're not using stem cells at this point in time, but that whole stem cell issue is extremely exciting, and the chapter hasn't been yet completed on that one.
So then, kind of on the other side of the treatment, how do you think prevention will move forward, and how do you think kind of that side of stopping it before it happens will be advanced?
Well, I think prevention should take 2 forms. Number 1, practice whatever the sport is in a way that's as safe as possible, at least when we're talking about head trauma. And that means taking the full hits to the head out of the practice. Practice hitting a robot. Practice hitting a tackling dummy. Don't hit another human being that's going to have the chance to be hitting you back. So I think the way we practice our activities are going to greatly change, and that's going to reduce dramatically the likelihood for head trauma. But the other thing I want you to understand, and I know you'll immediately grasp it, and I didn't talk about it when I was talking about the no tackling under 14. If we know that it's the correlation between years of exposure that will put you at greater chance for later life behavioral, cognitive, and mood issues, then for goodness sake, let's truncate that exposure. And the best way to do it is to take out the youth exposure, start you at high school. The majority of people that play football at high school, 1 in 10 will go on to play in college. So automatically, 9 out of 10 will only have a very, very short exposure. And even those that play at the next level are going to have a much shorter exposure than if they started, say, at the age of 5 or 10.
So then, kind of more going towards your own personal career, what was the most challenging or interesting medical case that you've encountered?
I probably can't give you just one case, but I can say that one of the most satisfying was the situation with Ted Johnson, who for a period of time was in a very difficult place, and he's been able to move on from that to now being in a talk radio position and doing very well with his life. And there have been a number that we've been able to be part of the team in helping, and it's just very gratifying.
Last question. We have all these kids here, and a good number of them are interested in becoming neuroscientists, of course. So what advice would you give them, and kind of what do you think is unique or special about the neuroscience profession?
Well, first I'd say do it, do it, do it. That's what got me into neurosurgery, was the fact I was between orthopedics, neuro-ophthalmology, and neurosurgery after I was in my 4th year of medical school trying to figure out what I wanted to do for a residency. And it was the science, the fact we know so little about the brain compared with other parts of the body that strongly drove me in that direction. I will only say this. It is very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to mix a clinical career with a scientific career. So don't feel that you have to go into a practicing neuroscience field like neurosurgery, because it'll be very difficult to spend a large part of your time practicing and still keep up with everything you'd like to at the basic science level.
Dr. Cantu, everybody.
Thank you.